Is the judge ready? Yes. Opponents ready?
Yep.
Partner ready? Yes. All right, time starts now. Theodore Roosevelt once said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." My name is Samantha, and today my partner and I affirm the resolution resolved. On balance, diplomacy is better maintained peace than military power. Peace means a pact or agreement to end hostilities between those who have been at war. We have 3 contentions for you today. 1, social diplomacy. 2, education diplomacy. And 3, economic diplomacy. Contention 1, social diplomacy. When nations give nations in crisis humanitarian and financial aid, they not only create stronger relations, but also a more interconnected and stable world. One example of social diplomacy is the Marshall Plan, where the U.S. pumped billions of dollars into war-ravaged Europe in order to prevent it from falling to the influence of the communist Soviet Union. They not only provided humanitarian aid through the use of food and medicine, but also advice for rebuilding infrastructures and also monetary grants. According to Diane Kuntz, the Marshall Plan served as the economic and political foundation for the Western alliance that waged war against the waged war. Michael J. Hogan said that the Marshall Plan causes gains in productivity, trade improvements, and an era of peace and prosperity more durable than any other in modern European history. Contention 2, education diplomacy. Education diplomacy uses skills of diplomacy in order to advance education and drive human development. One example is the 100,000 Strong campaign, which is a campaign to increase study abroad to China in order to strengthen the U.S.-China relationship. It has greatly increased the number of U.S. students studying in China, appearing to be a great success. 100,000 students was the goal, but according to statistics, after 4 years, the goal was not just achieved, but also surpassed. Education programs like these between nations, where countries form alliances and strengthen bonds, 1, improves the quality of education around the world, 2, promotes social stability, and 3, overall creates a more stable world. Contention 3, economic diplomacy. With trade agreements such as NAFTA, they have greatly expanded the global economy. This global economy has become an important incentive for nations to not engage in conflict. According to a study done by Matthew O. Jackson and Stephen A., they show that the addition of economic trade has led to a more peaceful world. He says, "The fundamental difficulty we find is that alliances are costly to maintain if there is no economic incentive. Looking at a period from 1950 to 2000, interstate war has gone down 10 times compared to the period before with 1850 to 1949. At the same time, international trade networks have increased 4 times, therefore showing a direct correlation. In addition, war-torn places also tend to be those with less trade alliances. For example, the Second Congo War, which showed the killings of more than 4 million people and also consisted of 8 African nations with relatively few trade ties. In contrast to this example, the relationship between U.S. and China has strengthened because of trade. China is currently our largest goods trading partner, with 578.6 billion total goods trade in 2016. If this were broken, this would have great consequences for both the U.S. and China, with consumers being hit with higher prices for imported goods. Thus, economic diplomacy maintains peace by creating a financial incentive for avoiding conflict between nations, so that nations have nothing to gain from engaging conflict, and it is better to stay peaceful. Therefore, for these three reasons, social diplomacy, education diplomacy, and economic diplomacy, we urge a pro-ballot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone ready for cross-ex?
Yes.
So starting time now. So in your first contention, you're talking about social diplomacy. I was wondering why other countries are willing to give away their money to other countries. Could you give the context of that situation? For example, the Marshall Plan that you cited?
Okay, so the Marshall Plan was created in order to basically help Europe sort of stand after World War II, because it wasn't a bad place. So the U.S. therefore gave this monetary grants, this aid for infrastructure, this advice in order to basically help Europe.
Okay, but what was in it for the United States? Why did they decide we're going to help them? They could have just left them alone.
Well, when you create a more when you create a more stable world, it benefits everyone, and they create strong allies, and so it has a mutual relationship. with the U.S. having strong allies and Europe getting something out of it, such as what we said before with humanitarian aid and food and medicine.
And then also the credentials of the people that provided analysis on the Marshall Plan. I didn't catch their names.
Okay. So the first one was Diane Kunz, and she's a professor of history at Yale. And the second one was, here, hold on a second, I need to flip through my cards. The second one was Michael J. Hogan, a professor of history at the University of Illinois at Springfield.
Okay, and then moving on to your second contention about educational diplomacy, what about non-state actors? How does that apply to non-state actors, or is that just for first world countries with well-rounded educational systems?
Wait, so can you rephrase the question, please?
So you talked about how sending American students to China actually helped ties with China. What about, but that's just one case, what about all the other countries that have non-state actors or that have dictatorships or have other problems where they don't have well-rounded educational systems? What do you do with those?
Well, the U.S. and China are both are countries that have a large influence on the world, and therefore when you see this sort of relationship being developed, such as through the 100K Strong campaign.
It's my present case, right?
Yes.
All right. Is my partner ready?
Yep.
Are my opponents ready?
Yes.
Alas, is my judge ready?
Yes.
All right. Then I think we shall begin. Now, Judge, imagine this situation. You and your friend have a disagreement. You try and make amends to asking your friend to come and have a discussion with you. Your friend agrees, knowing fully well he will not listen and will instead choose to put you through as much trouble as he possibly can. Can you do anything about it? No, because through diplomacy you'll have to rely on the person that you are having diplomatic relations with while they take advantage of you. After the talk, when your petty agreement remains unsolved, the consequences will be much graver. This is why today, my partner and I negate the resolution resolved. On balance, diplomacy has better maintained peace than military power. Our first contention, that military power is efficient whereas diplomacy is inefficient. First of all, diplomacy does not work a majority of the time. According to Robert J. Art, professor of international relations at Brandeis University, says, so far, diplomacy has a 32% success rate. Now, our opponents may tell you that this is irrelevant since we are only talking about one country. However, the United States is one of the biggest powers in the world and has been involved in quite a lot of conflicts. The fact is that one of the most prominent and affluent countries in the world has a diplomatic success rate of about 32% is quite shocking and says a lot about the current international atmosphere. Now, secondly, diplomacy depends too much on the other country. Consider this. What do you do when you're trying to solve a problem with a terrorist group or a country governed by a tyrant? Whether the issue is messianic terrorism, weapons proliferation, failed states managing regional conflicts, or whatever international problem one may care to name, the conclusion is always the same. Military power gets the job done. This can also be traced by the example used in our introduction. If your friend is not willing to create peace, you cannot get him to compromise, so tensions are higher. Also, military power is more efficient because of MAD, which is mutually assured destruction. A prime example of this is the Cold War, when two groups quarreled against each other but did not do anything damage because both sides had weapons to destroy each other. Now, moving on to our second contention, that when diplomacy fails, the military consequences are much larger. Judge, if we look back into history, we can see that when diplomacy fails, military consequences are much larger than the consequences of an outright war from the get-go. This can be seen by the end of World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles states that in 1919, George Clemenceau of France and Woodrow Wilson of England wanted to make a treaty or an agreement that punished Germany for all the damage that they did in World War I. Now, Woodrow Wilson wanted a treaty based on his 14-point plan, which would bring peace to Europe. Now, George Clemenceau wanted revenge. He wanted to make sure that Germany would never start another war again. So now, they found a compromise between the two, and that led into a treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the effects of those treaties on Germany was war guilt clause, that Germany should accept the blame for starting World War I. Reparations, Germany had to pay £6.6 billion for the damage caused by the war. Disarmament, Germany was not only allowed to have a small army and 6 naval ships. And finally, territorial clauses. Land was taken away from Germany and given to other countries. Now, the German people were very unhappy about the treaty, obviously, and thought that it was too harsh. Germany could not afford to pay the money, and during the 1920s, the people in Germany were very poor. There were not many jobs, and the price of food and basic goods were high. People were dissatisfied with the government and did not like the way how the treaty was formed. So now, when Hitler, the man, the myth, the legend, Hitler himself applied to become one of the main dictators or leaders of Germany, everybody across the world hated him, except for the German citizens, because he provided hope for them. He provided a fake hope that was distinguished or even started by the Treaty of Versailles, one of the biggest diplomatic failures in history. So, Judge, for those reasons, I urge a con ballot. Thank you. I now stand for cross-examination.
Is the judge ready? Yes. Opponents ready?
Yep.
Partner ready? Yes. All right, time begins now. Your first contention was about efficiency, correct?
Yes.
So for your citation about your 32% success rate,
Yes.
could you provide a number, provide any explanation to this? instead of
Methodology,
citing-
would that be? Like the methodology of the study?
No, basically like how many, like list studies, list examples that, what were the countries and conflicts in that actual?
It was actually all of the United States' use of diplomacy from 1946 to 1975.
But don't you agree that there are instances where diplomacy has worked?
32%.
How
Sure.
have you... All right, well, okay. Thank you. So for your second contention, or actually going back to your first contention when
yeah.
you talked about mutually assured destruction,
Yeah.
what do you think would happen if a rogue country such as North Korea, which is currently trying to get nuclear weapons, were to receive nuclear weapons and was in favor of using them harmfully? Because isn't the goal of isn't the doctrine of mutually assured destruction that if everyone has nuclear weapons, then there will be world peace?
So what are you telling me to tell you what happens?
Yeah. What?
You haven't provided any proof that what North Korea do. It's just a bunch of what ifs. You're telling me, what if North Korea gets a nuclear weapon? What if they do something about it? Right now, they haven't done anything about it because of mutually assured destruction.
But don't you agree that currently in society there are actual programs designed to actually limit the number of nuclear power or weapons in society, such as Global Zero, which is a campaign to create zero nuclear weapons in the world?
All I know is that mutually assured destruction has helped now, and because two forces that are at the same military level, they wouldn't attack each other or even harm each other because they don't want to destroy each other. They don't want to get each other in trouble.
But isn't that just a hypothetical? Thank you. Judge, ready? Yes.
Starting time now. Well, let's just start off by discrediting every single example they used, Judge, because in every single one of their contentions, the examples that backed them up were either between allies or between countries who have democracies at the head of them, or between programs that are actually used to instill between two countries that have already been at peace. Starting out with their first contention, social diplomacy. Number one, with the Marshall Plan. That was because the U.S. wanted allies, which could have been an anomaly, because now that the U.S. has what it needs, it doesn't need to create these allies. And you can't just be assured that one superpower is going to be okay with giving away billions of dollars to help other countries. Now, moving on to their second contention, educational diplomacy. Sending students over to China doesn't create diplomacy. We're just talking about having nice relations with people. Fine, that could be defined as diplomatic actions, but when we're talking about when there's a real problem, in that case, they didn't cite a real problem where sending over students actually helped. We're talking about some peaceful, nice trips that these students did to study abroad. We're not talking about military involvement, economic involvement, or political or social involvement, so that's also largely discredited. Moving on to economic agreements. What happens when these economic bonds disappear? A great example of this was between the Soviet Union and the United States. As we all know, after the Second World War, when the United States and the Soviet Union got engaged in what was called the Cold War. Because of MAD, as we talked about in our opening speech, these two superpowers had the nuclear power and the weapons necessary to destroy each other, but they did not take that step because they knew that they would end up destroying each other. Now, that kept the peace. And now we talked about, and the actual downfall of the Soviet Union was because of economic agreements basically crumbling. When the U.S. cut off economic agreements with Russia, that was the end of the Soviet Union. So you cannot rely on these economic agreements to keep the world united. Now, moving on, in their entire case as well, all of their examples were either from first world countries. They never included any examples of really big problems that were solved through diplomacy. There were no mentions of any sort of terrorism threats or tyrannies or dictatorships, which means that most of their examples only work when the countries have already reached an agreement. And most of these countries have been at war for a long time. Now, moving on, the Marshall Plan was also a reaction to military strategies that was worked. They've only provided examples from already proven ties, plus only powerful countries. What about Syria and North Korea? Sure, North Korea haven't deployed their weapons because of mutually assured destruction, which we prove again is a great factor in keeping the peace. And you can't just dismiss that because diplomatic relations are flimsy, they're ineffective, and you're relying too much on the other person. And none of their examples prove the real challenge that was overcome through diplomacy. And for all of these reasons, Judge, today we urge you to vote a con ballot.
Partner ready?
Yeah.
Partner ready? Judge ready? Yes. Time starts now. Wouldn't you agree that long-term peace greatly outweighs the big problems that you said are created from Okay, never mind. I'll go to the next question. You said that no big problems have been solved with diplomacy, correct?
No, I didn't say that. I said none of the problems that you cited in your case, there were no actual substantial big problems that could have ended up with disaster.
Okay, thank you. Isn't fostering global connections good for worldwide peace?
Yes, but those global connections don't actually have to be all positive in order to maintain peace.
So you are saying then it is okay to negatively harm a country in order to create global worldwide relations?
No, what I'm saying is that the relations between two countries, whatever those may be, as long as they're keeping them out of huge conflict and disaster, it's doing its job at maintaining peace, and the resolution doesn't state what type of peace it needs to be. So as long as there is peace, it's fine.
You stated that diplomacy is flimsy, correct?
Yes.
Well, never mind, I have a different question. I remember you stated in your opening speech the example of a 32 success rate, right? And that was from the 1940s to the 1970s, right, the
Yes.
study? Wouldn't you say that's out of date because there's a 40-year time span between now and when that study finished?
Well, if we're going to use that logic, then your Marshall Plan example is also out of date because that's even older.
Time starts now. Hello, I'm Helen Bakablou, and I will be attacking my opponent's case. Starting with the first contention about the efficiency of military power and how diplomacy isn't efficient at all, I have three responses. First of all, they cite a study from the 1940s to the 1970s stating that there was a 32% success rate when it came to diplomacy. But that's a 40-year time span of which there has been a lot of change. Examples being the Israeli peace treaty with both Egypt and Jordan signed, which settled relations and adjusted land and water disputes. There's also the opening of China that Nixon strengthened with his visits with China. Second of all, our opponents keep saying that, yes, diplomacy is bad, but they really never state any obvious signs that military itself is bringing peace. If if you're not giving an example, then how can you say that it is more effective at its job if we don't really know how effective it is? Third of all, they state about mutually assured destruction, but the problem is that with diplomacy, you can still stop the use of nuclear weapons with Nuclear Zero, which is a campaign for nuclear weapons to be stopped, which has been signed up by over 300 world leaders. And there's also the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and promote the cooperation in peaceful ways of nuclear energy, and to further the goal of achieving nuclear disarmament. Moving on to their second contention about diplomacy fails, and then there are war consequences which are a lot worse. I only have one response to that, and it says that military itself can also be very deadly. So the thing is, if you look at the military responses in places like Iraq or Afghanistan or Indochina, there are a lot of people who died. Killing isn't going to lead your way to victory. So you have to weigh the consequences. Is it the consequences of war better or the consequences of diplomacy? That is all. Please vote for pro ballot.
Could we have some prep time, please? We'll run it. Do you have any examples? Okay, thank you.
That's 1 minute and 31 seconds in total.
I won't ask about this. If I have time, let me just set up my timer real quick. And is my partner ready?
Yep.
Are my opponents ready?
Yes.
Finally, is my judge ready?
Yes.
All right, then we shall begin now. So, in your attack speech, you tell us an organization called Nuclear Zero, that they prevent nuclear weapons from being used?
Well, it is a campaign for the...
So what does it do?
It is generally trying to lessen the number of nuclear weapons.
Has it worked in the past? If so, please provide examples, and how does Nuclear Zero work?
Okay,
Do you guys not have an answer for this? All right, if you guys don't have an example, it's fine. Then moving on to the next question. You say near the end of your speech that a lot of people died in situations such as Iraq.
yes.
Do you know the exact number or about the general specific amount of number who died?
Not specifically in Iraq.
All right. Do you think, not in Iraq, maybe in all examples where military power was used?
Well, I generally don't know every
All right.
single death from everywhere.
I'm just asking for numbers here, not too much to ask for. And now, so the Israeli peace treaty, correct?
Yes.
You talked about that in your attack speech, but don't you agree that saying one example doesn't mean that diplomacy has more than a 32% success rate?
Well, I also provided another one.
Does 2 examples make it so great?
Well, have you provided examples?
I'll provide it in my defense speech. And now you say that the 40-year time span from our study, correct?
Yes.
The Marshall Plan was instituted before that study, so wouldn't you say the Marshall Plan is outdated as well? And not only outdated, but an anomaly because the United States no longer needs any more allies?
In this speech, I will be defending my case. My opponent talked about how these are examples that we provided aren't reliable because they're first world countries. However, we have provided evidence that this not only works for first world countries, but also all countries. The Middle East isn't a first world country, and as we have shown, there have been the Israel peace treaty, the European debt crisis, and our opponent tried to make a claim that just because there are only 2 examples, that it doesn't even matter. However, these examples don't even count in their study, and there are countless more examples. So how can we rely on a study that says that there are 32, that diplomacy has a 32 success rate, when we have clearly shown that there are other examples that aren't even included in the study in a 40-year gap? Therefore, this statistic is unreliable and cannot be used to judge this debate. Also, they talked about how they talked about how diplomacy is too flimsy and relying on too much of other people. However, they've just cited a hypothetical scenario. They have not provided any statistics that diplomacy is flimsy. They have not provided any statistics. They've just mentioned a story about diplomacy being too flimsy. However, military power is extremely flimsy as well, because when you're trying to create war, there's no guarantee that you'll ever get anything good out of it, because and so therefore their point is invalid. Also, they talked about how how in the Second War, in the Cold War between Russia, there was mutually assured destruction. However, when we look at societies right now, such as North Korea, we see that mutually assured destruction isn't a guarantee at all, because countries are gaining, such as North Korea, are gaining these nuclear weapons as we speak, and therefore, with diplomacy is a better way to solve this, with programs, as my opponent mentioned, such as Global Zero, and also such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is to prevent the nuclear spread of weapons. So as we are saying, there are better ways to solve this than killing people. Thank you. Vote for Bo. Pro.
We'll be taking some prep starting now.
First, I'm going to say the impact. All right, then we shall begin. So, when my opponent attacked our first contention, first of all, they started by attacking our 32% success rate argument. Well, I'm going to turn it back on them because they said that our argument was old or outdated. So, I'd like to also say the Marshall Plan, that was more than 40 years ago. That was more than 42 years ago. So wouldn't that also be outdated and quite possibly be an anomaly for America or the United States? Because now the United States doesn't need any more allies. Europe has quite enough money to support themselves after a war. And now they gave us two examples, and I'd like to give them two examples of just how MAD or military power helped contain the situation. And these are situations only when nuclear war was threatened. So right now, North Korea versus the United States, the only reason why MAD is guaranteed is because North Korea is so much smaller than a country like Russia. And if MAD worked during the Cold War against Russia, then why wouldn't it work against North Korea, where now we are much more technologically advanced and North Korea is so minuscule compared to Russia? And now, moving on to their attacks on our second contention, I'd like to fire back by proving the impacts. Are the impacts of all of these small battles or all of these small wars bigger than World War II, the greatest and biggest war in history, where over 60 million people died, Judge? If we put that on a scale, I think those 60 million people dead is much more detrimental and effective to our community and environment. And now, I'd also like to talk about talking about diplomacy being flimsy. Diplomacy is flimsy by giving one of the best examples, the start of World War II, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was a diplomatic reason. The Treaty of Versailles failed. World War II was caused by a diplomatic reason, Judge. We can just assume that. We know that, Judge. So for all these reasons, I urge a con ballot. Thank you.
Starts now. Judge, I generally believe that for this round, you should be voting pro for the following reasons. Number one, economic diplomacy. Although our opponents state the example of the disappearance of the USSR and U.S. relations, we have shown with the evidence that we provided that during the Second Congo War, since there were no or minimal trade partner relationships, that over 4 million people died because of this. Doesn't that impact mean something? That without these trade relationships, that people are dying and that war is being caused? Shouldn't we at least try to use economic diplomacy to solve the problem? And our opponent says that the impact of World War II is over that 60 million people died. Using that argument, shouldn't that help us? Because if 60 million people are dying, then why go turn to war when you could turn to diplomacy? Diplomacy, if we use, in the sense of the Marshall Plan, even though our opponents say it's outdated and old, it helped the European countries because they did not have money to pay for it. They were in debt because of war. So it's obviously working. In a pro world, we're trying to better and save lives, and we're trying to make sure that countries are able to have talks with each other without resorting to war first. And in a con war, they're saying that, well, diplomacy doesn't seem to be working, so let's automatically go and try and kill other people because that seems to be the answer. Thank you, and please vote for a pro ballot.
Do you want to take a prep time? We have like 30 seconds.
I'm good. Partner ready?
Yep.
Opponents ready?
Yeah.
Judge ready?
Yes.
Starting time now. So here's why we're winning this debate today. Number one, during this entire debate, our opponents have been making claims left and right without any sort of substantial evidence, claiming that our evidence is outdated when their evidence is even older. They haven't found any evidence that counteracts our evidence directly. So all of our evidence still stands, where we have disproved that they don't know how their peace treaties work. They weren't able to explain how they were going to get the nuclear weapons out of these countries' hands. All of their ties were based on friendly countries that were actually working together, and they just believe in an idealistic world where trade partners just appear magically and everybody is happy with sending over people. That needs to get done, and most of the reason why any of their examples existed was because of the wars that preceded them. Moving on to defending our case. When we talked about our first contention about how military action is efficient, it is. We gave an entire case. We're talking here about the entire Cold War, and even up to today, the only reason that another bomb has not been dropped after the end of World War II is because of mutually assured destruction. And our opponents have not understood that our case isn't let's go to war immediately. We're saying that we can use military might and weapons without even firing them to maintain peace. So we're not killing anyone. We're not going off to war as they claim. We're just using the weapons that we already have to make sure that people know what they're doing. Going back to their opening speech with speak softly but carry a big stick, that's exactly what we're going for. That's our entire point. If you have a larger country who's willing to have the missiles that could be used to annihilate someone but don't use them, you're still guaranteeing peace, and you're still no one is getting killed. Then we're talking about diplomatic failure. Yes, diplomacy failed. Number one, the Treaty of Versailles. That caused 60 million people dying. It wasn't the war. Yes, of course, the war was fought as a result of the failure of this diplomatic tie. So that's the reason why our first contention stands. Yes, military might is efficient. It worked for over 40 years. And contention two, yes, you need military power to back someone up. And for all of these reasons today, we urge a con ballot.